I sat down the other day and tried to figure out just how many sermons I'd preached over the course of my career. And as best as I can estimate, it's probably somewhere around 1,500. I must say that I was rather surprised at that large of a number, both because it just seems like a lot of sermons for anyone to have preached, but also because it's hard for me to believe that anyone could have that much to say, even over 30-plus years of ministry. Which then got me to thinking, what did I have to say? What have I been talking about all these years? Well, the more I thought about it, the more it struck me that if I were to go back and reread all those sermons, and let me assure you right now that I have no intention whatsoever of doing that, but if I were to do that, then I suspect those 1,500 sermons would fall roughly into three categories. The first of them would be sermons exploring the gospel and its meaning for us as individuals. That is to say, what the gospel means for you and me personally. The second category would be sermons dealing with the gospel's meaning for us as a church, and specifically for the past 10 years or so for this congregation. What does the gospel mean for the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia? What does the gospel mean for other communities of faith as well? And then finally, there would be a third category, quite a number of sermons focused on the larger society of which the church is a part, and what the gospel means for us then as an integral part of that society. What does the gospel have to say, not just to George Schneider or to the First Presbyterian Church, but to the city of Philadelphia and indeed to the entire world? And as I look back and think about the sermons I have preached, particularly the ones that have most stuck in my mind, I'd guess that there have been, on the whole, relatively few in that first category, the ones focused mostly on individuals and what the gospel means to us personally. I would then think there have been considerably more sermons in that second category, the gospel concerning congregations. But most of all, I suspect would be the sermons in the third of those categories. In fact, I would guess that at least half of the sermons I have preached over the years, and perhaps more, have been focused on the larger society around us and the direction that the gospel gives us in terms of what our society should be like, at the very least what it should aspire to be like, and what the church's role then should be in seeking to bring about that end. Now, that my preaching should be oriented in that direction, that is to say, toward the larger society, is no coincidence at all. In fact, it's entirely predictable, given the fact, first, that this is a Presbyterian church, and specifically an American Presbyterian church, and second, that I was trained in the particular manner that I was, and specifically in the particular place where I received my theological education. You see, the fact is, we're Protestants. And in particular, we're part of what is called the Reformed tradition, which from the time of Calvin himself has been concerned with reforming the larger society every bit as much as simply reforming the church. Indeed, more than anything else, that is what has historically distinguished our tradition from others, even from other Protestants. And that has been especially true here in the United States, for the dream of building a righteous society goes back to the very origins of our nation. For as John Winthrop put it so famously in a sermon that was preached in the year 1630, their aim was to build a city upon a hill for all the world to see, an example of righteousness. Not just a church, but a city. And if that weren't enough to orient my preaching in this particular direction, the fact is that I also received my own theological training in that city built upon a hill. And in fact, at the very university that Winthrop and his fellow Puritans founded. Not that by the time I got there were all that many Puritans left, but by the time I finished, by God, there was one. In fact, it was there that I came to regard so highly the book of Deuteronomy, a book that for the American Puritans was not just an interesting ancient story, but was in fact a template for the building of their society. For like the ancient Israelites, they too believed that they had come into a land flowing with milk and honey, and therefore were under a divine obligation to build a society that was founded on the biblical mandates of justice and righteousness. And that, in a nutshell, has been a major thrust of my preaching for the past 30 years. But now I'm beginning to think that needs to change. That I need to be less concerned with the larger society around us and more concerned with the church and with us as individual Christians. And that's what I want us to think about today, because that represents a pretty significant change. It's certainly a big change in my own thinking. And let me be very clear about this. It's not that I don't care about our society and what it's like. I do care. In fact, I care very deeply, just as much as I ever have. The problem that we face today is that I'm just not sure there's very much the church can do to influence our society now, at least not the church in its present form. Now, of course, there was a time, and not all that long ago, when the church did have the power and influence to change our society. But if we think that's true today, we're suffering under a grand illusion. There may be places where the church still has that kind of power these days, but not here. Not even the Roman Catholic Church here in Philadelphia wields that kind of power anymore. The growing diversity, religiously speaking, of the population and the declining presence of religion in our society in general have all combined to largely dampen the voice of the church that is heard in this society. And because of that, I think the focus of the church must almost inevitably turn inward. Turn inward in the direction of congregations and individuals, in terms of the activity of our faith, the locus of our efforts, and the place where our religious DNA is preserved and passed on. And if you say, but hasn't that always been the case? The answer actually is no, it hasn't, not for us. Because far more than I think we're aware of, our religious tradition, in the broadest and most important sense of that word, has been preserved and passed on in various social structures and institutions, and most of all, in certain colleges and universities, far more than it has simply within the narrow ecclesiastical structures of the church. There's always been more, much more, to being a Presbyterian than simply attending a Presbyterian church. And the problem is that now a lot of that other stuff is gone. It no longer exists in the form it once did. And just about all that's left of our religious tradition now is the church itself. And so for now, at least, that's where we should, I think, focus our efforts. That's where we've got to rebuild our base and our sense of what it means to be a Presbyterian, or for that matter, simply to be a Christian. In fact, right now, our life together here in this congregation may be more important than it's ever been before in the long history of this church in terms of our identity. This is where faith is going to have to be nurtured, because it's not going to happen anywhere else. And if we're ever again going to have a voice in the larger society around us, if we hope ever again to be in a position to contribute to the shaping of that larger society, then we're going to have to find our voice and claim that voice, and we're going to have to do it here first. And until we do that, I'm afraid we'll never be heard amongst all the competing voices in our society these days, voices that in many cases are a whole lot louder and a lot more determined than ours right now. In other words, I'm suggesting that the church has found itself in the wilderness. And of course, that's not anything like the first time that's ever happened. The church has found itself increasingly out of step with the society of which it thinks itself a part. Our situation today, while perhaps somewhat uncomfortable, maybe even somewhat embarrassing to those of us who remember the glory days of American Protestantism, still, our situation today is certainly nothing like as dire as that which the church has faced at many other times in its history. The challenge that we face can't even be compared to the crisis in the German church of the 1930s, when not only the state, but even the church itself was corrupted by Nazi ideology. But precisely because our situation is nowhere near that dramatic, the alternatives are perhaps not as readily apparent to us either. This is, I genuinely think, a time of testing for us, not unlike the time of testing that Jesus himself underwent in the wilderness, a time for finding out who we really are. Whether we're Christians simply because we happen to have been born Christians and have always gone to church, or because we personally actually believe something. Whether we're Christians because we have embraced a life of discipleship under the leadership of Jesus Christ, or simply because we rather like the privileges and status that have historically gone along with being American Christians, and in particular, with being American Presbyterians. It might be interesting to find out, if we were forced to choose, whether we'd opt for wielding real power and influence in this world, or for remaining faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as much as we'd all like to believe it would never come to that, at least not here, frankly, I'm not sure but what it hasn't already come to that. Which is not to say that a time of testing is a bad thing, because it's not. All four Gospels make quite clear that it was his time of testing that prepared Jesus for the ministry that lay ahead. And by the same token, I am convinced that the church will emerge from our time of testing, our time in the wilderness, as a stronger and more determined church, a church with a much clearer sense of who we are, and just as important, who we are not. And that is a church that will have a voice, a strong voice, in the shaping of that larger society of which we are indeed a part. Because our goal is still to build that city upon a hill. We've got to prepare ourselves for that job. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor now and forever.